Let me start by saying that it goes without saying that the world would be better off if Iran does not become a nuclear-armed state. And achieving that goal should be our principal aim going forward. However, despite our best efforts, that undesirable end may very well come to pass. But should we act as if this is the first time that we've encountered such a challenge, or that the logic of containment and deterrence somehow does not apply to Iran, that Iran is a breed apart outside of the realm of politics as we know it? The answer is no. As troublesome and menacing as Iran has been, its behavior still reflects the pursuit of national interest. It has a strategy, it pursues it, and in the course of doing so, it reacts to incentives and pressure. We don't approve of its methods, but we understand its goals. In short, Iran is a familiar problem, one with which we have plenty of experience. During the Cold War, we managed peace and prosperity in Europe and Asia, containing both nuclear-armed Soviet Union and China. We may parse details as to what the similarities are in the Middle East, but the principle is very clear. And we are still guaranteeing peace and prosperity in Asia by containing a very dangerous North Korean regime that is armed with nuclear weapons and on a weekly basis threatens to set Seoul on fire. India, too, has been prospering while tolerating a grave nuclear danger from a country neighboring, which is known for its instability, adventurism, and support for terrorism. And that situation has been going on for over two decades, and yet there is a stable containment situation in which the Indian economy has been prospering. It is often argued that Iran is different because the Iranian regime is irrational and it's messianic, so much so that it's impervious to the logic of containment and deterrence. It is assumed that Iran's singular aim is to start a nuclear Armageddon the minute that it acquires nuclear weapons, that it is actually religiously mandated to do so. There are plenty of American politicians that believe in the rapture, but that does not mean that you can read American foreign policy on the basis of that suggestion. If Iranians were truly driven by messianism in their foreign policy, they would have reacted when the shrine most directly associated with their hidden imam was blown up in Iraq in 2006, and yet they didn't. The last time Iran attacked a neighbor was in 1859 to reclaim Afghan territories that were snatched away by Great Britain. The record of the past 3 decades shows that as objectionable and problematic as Iran's behavior has been, it is still driven by the cold calculations of regime survival and national interest. You don't need a degree in Islamic studies to understand Iranian strategy or to conclude that the regime that has survived in power for 3 decades could not be suicidal or completely reckless. In fact, despite its bluster and support for terrorism, Iran has been more accepting of international norms than was the case with communist China or is the case with North Korea or even Pakistan. We talk about the proliferation issue, but let us remember, it was Pakistan, while in America's tight embrace, and not Iran, that began to acting as a nuclear eBay. If we are to say that we will not tolerate a nuclear Iran if that becomes the case, then we have to basically say we're prepared to go down the path to war with Iran. We should ask ourselves, can we tolerate another major war in the Middle East? This time with a country that is twice as large, twice as populous as Iraq, has much larger landmass, that its capital city is 2,000 kilometers and 2 mountain ranges away from the nearest port facilities. Will that war actually be effective? Will it get the job done? How long will that war take? 5 years? 10 years? 20 years? Longer? How much would it cost? How many more trillions of dollars would this war cost the United States? How many Americans would die in such a war? 10,000? 15,000? More? How would such a war impact the Middle East, or America for that matter? Do we want such a war? Can we tolerate it? It seems that Americans have already answered this from the president on down. They have answered these questions very clearly, and it's a resounding no. They don't want such a war. The good news is that they don't have to have it. If it becomes necessary, if the efforts, diplomatic efforts, the sanctions to stop Iran in its tracks were to fail, we can manage a nuclear Iran, just as we managed a nuclear Soviet Union, communist China, North Korea, and Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really understand the position of the opposing team. I understand the fear, I understand the danger, I understand the challenge. Let me put this in some historical perspective. After the Cold War, the United States was the only country in the world with nuclear weapons. And then the Soviet Union acquired a nuclear weapon. And there were many people who felt, many very serious people, that this was an absolute calamity and that the only recourse the United States had was a preemptive war against Russia, against the Soviet Union. This was a position not held by wacky warmongers. Bertrand Russell, the pacifist philosopher, argued in favor for that. Harold Nicholson, the cool, unsentimental British diplomat, argued in favor of that. But a man like Dwight Eisenhower understood that rollback, a strategy of preemptive war, would have huge costs and undergo huge consequences. And so he opted instead for a strategy called deterrence and containment. Keep the Soviet Union in a box, put pressure on them so that they found it difficult to operate, and maintain the deterrence that says to them, if you try to do something, you yourself will be annihilated. Now remember, the Soviet Union at the time was regarded as a wild, crazy, revolutionary power bent on global revolution. Remember that Stalin had just sacrificed tens of millions of his people in World War II in the Eastern Front, something that was unfathomable to Western statesmen. They were routinely called irrational, crazy, wide-eyed, messianic, all the things you've heard about Iran. But we learned that the proper course of action was not rollback and a preemptive war, but containment and deterrence. Then we watched this again in China. John Kennedy feared that if China went nuclear, 25 countries would go nuclear. Well, China did go nuclear. And Mao was truly crazy. Mao openly talked about the need for a nuclear war. He said it would cause sacrifices, but it would be educational. And he said half the world will be destroyed, but the other half will be socialist. Now that's a crazier, more messianic comment than anything the Iranian mullahs have ever said. And yet, what we learned was that Mao could be contained and deterred. And then, as Vali mentioned, we watched this in the country I grew up in India. India and Pakistan fought a war every 15 years after independence. They fought three wars in 30 years. And then they got nuclear weapons. And in the last 40 years, they haven't fought a war since. Now, every time you will, of course, see tensions and you will see crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis, because these powers are in conflict with one another. But what's extraordinary is that during the Cold War, despite this intense geopolitical rivalry, which would have told you, all history would have suggested that the United States and Soviet Union would have gone to war with one another. They didn't because of nuclear weapons, because they were deterred, because of the fear of what it would mean. Margaret Thatcher understood this. In 1989, she gave a speech standing with Mikhail Gorbachev, and she said, "You and I, Mr. Secretary General, know that conventional weapons have never deterred war in Europe, but nuclear weapons have done so for 40 years, she said in 1989. Make that 70 years. North Korea, when it went nuclear, we were told all of Asia was going to go nuclear. Japan would go nuclear. South Korea would go nuclear. You could understand why. South Korea is still in a state of active arms. It's at war with North Korea. And yet that hasn't happened. South Korea hasn't gone nuclear. Japan hasn't gone nuclear. What the lesson of North Korea has been, if you're a third-rate dysfunctional country that manages to acquire a couple of crude nuclear devices, you remain a third-world dysfunctional country with a couple of crude nuclear devices. Power does not flow from the barrel of crude nuclear weapons. It flows from your GDP, from your innovation, from your technological prowess. And so we come to Israel, and we come to the challenge that Iran places there. And what I would argue is that the Iranians, as Vali has pointed out, are cool, calculating, shrewd, far more so in their rhetoric and in their actions, certainly in their actions, than any of the regimes we are talking about. They will be deterred. They will be deterred by Israel's 200 to 500 nuclear weapons. Remember, Israel has many on submarines so that they have second strike capacity. They will be deterred by America's vast arsenal of nuclear weapons. And recall, they don't have any yet. We're talking about a hypothetical situation. And yet what we are talking about is a war in the Middle East where we would go and strike a regime preemptively. And what would happen? The regime would gain support at home. Every regime that has ever been attacked by foreigners preemptively has the effect of rallying people around that regime. We would be able to destroy part of the infrastructure, but they would be able to rebuild it very quickly. Israel's own estimates are that they would delay the program by 2 years. You would radicalize the Middle East and turn the mullahs and this regime into a much more popular force in the Middle East than it is now. Meanwhile, we have a containment strategy and a deterrence strategy. We have enormous pressure on them. The sanctions have been crippling their economy. They have not been able to develop a nuclear weapon. The Israeli intelligence that I have received in my 10 years as a journalist, every year for the last 10 years I have been told that Iran is 1 year away from getting a nuclear bomb. Either Israeli intelligence is very bad, or we have been very good at deterring and containing Iran.
Fareed is giving us this scenario of what will happen if and when Israel or the U.S. attacks, rallying to the government, destruction of the Green Movement. And he went on and on, he elaborated on all the details. The problem with his analysis is we have two actual empirical historical examples of exactly what he's talking about, the preemptive denuclearization of a country. General Yadlin here beside me was involved in the first. He dropped the bombs on the first. Iraq, what's Iraq? 1981. The reaction from Iraq, zero.
They rebuilt their nuclear program, however.
Did they go to war? Did they attack? Was there a rallying? No.
It took more than 2 years.
That's number one. Number two.
They rebuilt their nuclear program, precisely what I pointed out. When
the
Gulf War happened, what the inspectors found was an Iraqi nuclear program, which had been built after Osirak.
They did not.
In 10 years, not 2 years.
This was 10 years later. The West went into Iraq and found that it had not rebuilt and created a bomb. So it gained a decade. Number two, in 2007, there was an attack on the Syrian facility from North Korea that was a nuclear facility. Reaction, zero. Syria didn't even announce the attack. Second, if we had not done that, if the Israelis, acting on behalf of the West, I would argue, had not done that, what would be happening in Syria today? The world is terrified about the loose chemical and biological weapons that are in Syria that we know are there, that the regime has declared, and that the jihadists and the al-Qaeda elements in Syria could easily acquire. That's why we're so vigilant, the United States standing on the border in Jordan as a way to preempt the transfer. The reason there are no nukes involved is because of the preemption. That's why the hyperproliferation is so important. And the blithe assurance that we get from our opponents that somehow there would be this great reaction to rallying to the regime. This regime in Iran is detested by the overwhelming majority of the people, and particularly by the young, as we saw in the Green Revolution. It was suppressed. If there were, for example, a U.S. attack that not only attacked nukes, but attacked elements of regime strength, like the Revolutionary Guards, that could be the occasion for a revival of the revolution. The Revolutionary Guards who tortured the young people in the streets are not heroes, and they would not become heroes if they were to be the victims of a U.S. or Israeli attack on the nuclear facilities. I think it could have the opposite effect, galvanizing a population that hates an oppressive theological regime at a time where the regime would be at its weakest.
Nasr, and then to you. Just either side, back and forth, okay? Nasr, you're the expert on Iran. Tell us why that's not true.
First of all, to the first point, Syria and Iraq are not Iran. In terms of size, capability, location, size of population, amount of weight they have in the Middle East. The reaction for Iran could potentially be orders of magnitude different. Secondly, I don't know of any population that is going to side with the outsiders bombing its country, especially because this is not about democracy. We are not putting sanctions on Iran for democracy and human rights. We're not bombing Iran for democracy and human rights. We're bombing it and pressuring it for something that potentially the Iranian people actually believe in. It's their technology. Their government has told them this is for peaceful purposes. And the Iranians are probably as affectionate about their nuclear program as the Pakistanis or Indians are about theirs.
What about Libya last year?
Well, Libya is not Iran.
We bombed, and the population applauded us. We were heroes.
You were bombing them not for the nuclear program. You were bombing them to protect them from the authoritarian regime.
You just said no government is attacked and the people rally on behalf of the attackers.
The pretext
I gave you an example that happened within a year.
No, the pretext matters. What makes you think the Iranians would rally? Does the example of 1953, when we intervened in Iran and the reaction we got suggests that the Iranians would side with us? Or the example of the Iran-Iraq war, when as soon as Saddam attacked, even the moderate, liberal, democratic population, they all hurried to the clerics.
Because they hate a regime that shoots young women in the street, tortures demonstrators, and then delivers the body to the family. That's why they would rally. If there were people who opposed their oppressors and their torturers. And when it happened in Libya, they rallied.
Are you saying Iran or Iraq? Did you get the last letter mixed up? Because we heard all this about the Iraq war. The Iraqis were going to love us because we were bombing them into freedom and democracy, and it didn't quite work out that way.
And who rallied?
I think you got the letter wrong.
So we caught up with Dr. Kissinger in New York last week. Let's have a listen to his intervention in this debate. Roll tape.
Thank you, Rudyard. For a decade and a half, American presidents from both political parties have declared that an Iranian nuclear military capability is unacceptable, and that no option is off the table in preventing it. If Iran emerges from this process, which was joined also by other members of the UN Security Council, with a military nuclear capability, the psychological and strategic balance in the region will be transformed. The countries of the region and elsewhere will look to the development of nuclear weapons for their own security. Non-proliferation as an international goal will be ended or severely jeopardized. The credibility of Western strategy will be severely damaged. It is essential that the United States and its allies define what they mean by Iranian nuclear military capability and what they mean by the term unacceptable.
I think that the United States' position on this issue, which is a somewhat technical point but worth going into, is understandably ambiguous. You do not want to signal in advance exactly at what point you would go to war. You know who else has exactly the same position? The government of Israel. Even though the Israeli Prime Minister has been asking Washington to draw a red line, Israel itself has not drawn a red line, and I would argue they are right not to draw a red line. You want to keep the other guy guessing. You want to keep the pressure on. You don't want to be entirely clear as to when, you don't want to give the other person your timetable for war. It's one thing if they do something, an action like invading a country that triggers an obvious response. But in a situation like this, we retain much more room to maneuver and much more flexibility if we maintain some degree of strategic ambiguity, as the Israelis are doing. It is important to point out the Iranians do not have nuclear weapons. And in fact, there is something worth pointing out here. Not only do they not have nuclear weapons, but the supreme leader of Iran has issued a fatwa, a religious edict, saying it would be un-Islamic to have them, and that the founder of the regime, Ayatollah Khomeini, believed it was un-Islamic to have nuclear weapons. Now, of course they could be lying. But it would be rather odd for a regime that relies on it for its legitimacy on religious edicts to unnecessarily issue these edicts. And nobody's asking them to say this stuff, right? So the fact that they are doing that also suggests that the Iran may have a complicated calculation of its own, that they want some kind of capacity, and that buys them a certain degree of influence, but they are not seeking to have an arsenal all ready to go. And that reality is the one we have to live with in trying to figure out exactly what Iranian action would trigger an American or Israeli response. And that's why the Americans and the Israelis, understandably, are maintaining that ambiguity.
So, Vali Nasr, I want to give you the last word here before we move on to our closing statements.
Well, there are many strategic reasons why Iran would want nuclear capability, a virtual nuclear program, or an actual bomb. And as I said, it has to do with regime survival and its national interest. But if what you're saying is true, then sanctions and diplomacy will not work. Then we're back to the argument. Do we want to go to war to stop it? Or are we going to agree to that we can handle this through containment and deterrence? Because you said that aggressive sanctions may work, and that international pressure may work, or maybe diplomacy in the second term may work. But according to you, they've already made the decision that they're going to do this because it goes down to that they don't want to have the fate of Syria, Iraq, and Libya, and that they want to have the security that North Korea and Pakistan feel. And if that's the case, then the only option on the table is that we either contain them and deter them, or that we go to war with them.
Thank you. When I was a kid in college, I invited Caspar Weinberger, Reagan's defense secretary, to campus to speak. There was a huge amount of commotion and many protests against him, all from the left. There were people in an audience this size who started standing up and chanting against him. And what they kept saying, the phrase they kept using one after the other, was deterrence is a lie. Because in those days, it was the left that didn't understand deterrence, because they were emotional and irrational, and they felt, surely there's got to be a better way around this. And it was the wise heads, the sane people on the right, steeped in realism and history and tragedy, who reminded us of the need for deterrence. One such person very brilliantly put this. He said, almost once every 25 years, a new generation discovers the horrors of the bomb and the paradoxes of deterrence and looks for a way out. But alas, he said, there is no way out. Deterrence, like old age, is intolerable until one considers the alternative. That was Charles Krauthammer about 25 years ago. So what I want to say to Charles is, come home, Charles Krauthammer. Come home to the sad, necessary task of building a powerful containment and deterrence strategy against Iran. Of course, nobody wants an Iran with nuclear weapons. Of course, one wishes to place every obstacle in the way, put as much pressure as is possible. And of course, we want to have precisely the same strategy we had in the Cold War of containing and deterring them, so that eventually we create circumstances where the young people of Iran can take their country back, and they will have acquired a desire for modernity and for an integration with the West and for freedom and liberty. And that is the course we are trying to move on. But there is no fantasy solution out there that says, we cannot tolerate this, and we are going to go to war instead, and we are going to preemptively strike another country in the Middle East, and they will love us for it, and they will embrace us, and all of a sudden, the problems of the Middle East will go away because we will have gotten rid of that evil thing, deterrence. Alas, that isn't how it works. International politics will persist, international rivalries will persist, the Middle East will continue to be a complicated place. Haven't we just gone through a decade of 2 wars in the Middle East, both of which were sold to us on the promise that this was going to usher in a new era in which everyone was going to love the United States and the West, and all the problems that existed would go away? And yet we find ourselves in the same situation. So I say, come home, Charles Krauthammer, come home to the kind of reason and history and logic that you once so powerfully believed in and argued in. Don't give in to just because of the fact these guys are different and they're brown and they're colored, that somehow we have to have fantastic solutions.
Thank you. Well, I take General Yadlin's cautions and warnings quite seriously, and I do think that there are important and stark choices that face us and will face the new American administration going forward. Obviously, we think of the biggest issue in the Middle East being Iran, not only because it's a dictatorial regime that is abusing its population, that is taunting Israel and its neighbors, that it supports terrorism, and now to boot it's going nuclear. But when we think about decisions about Iran, we have to also know that every decision has a context. The context is the following, that Iran is not the only issue in the region. We're also seeing a Middle East that is falling apart all across the board, from Tunisia to Libya to Egypt to Bahrain. Regime after regime is becoming unstable. We're seeing rise of extremism. We're seeing a major shift in this region. We're not going to be dealing with Iran in a vacuum, and therefore the decisions we make have to be with view to what it means for the region. We're also dealing with a United States that is tired of war, that it has not done well in the two big wars that it conducted in the Middle East. It doesn't have a record to show for. It spent trillions of dollars, a lot of blood and treasure, and it has not been able to accomplish its objectives, whether it's in Afghanistan or whether it's in Iraq. And it's very clear that the Americans are more interested these days in nation building at home, as the president put it. These are important contexts to bear in mind. Now, hopefully, the Iranian regime will change, as Dr. Krauthammer and General Yadlin said. Hopefully, the administration will take diplomatically very seriously, and by some miracle, there is a breakthrough in the short run. Or that sanctions really change the Iranian government's mind and they change course. But the clocks for diplomacy, for sanctions, for regime change in Iran are not synchronized with the clock for building Iran's nuclear capability. It is quite likely, it's quite possible, that Iran may go nuclear before any of these things take effect, before sanctions, as rigorous they are, produce a result, or before there is a democracy movement. Then we're really left with two choices. We either find a way to contain and deter a nuclear Iran, or we go to war with it. And if we go to war with it, then we have to be prepared for what that war would entail. And it may very well be that it would be far more costly and far more destabilizing to the region than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were. We started sectarian war in the Middle East. The Shia-Sunni war that our commentators lamented about was our doing. It is another war that is intolerable, is equally intolerable. Thank you.